You know how sometimes after a really big shock, maybe a huge storm or a political crisis, it feels like the world just, I don't know, shifts. And things that seemed impossible before suddenly become the new normal.
Absolutely. It's like the ground rules change overnight.
Exactly. So let's unpack this because the document you shared, Naomi Klein's La Doctrina del Shock, really digs into this very idea how these moments of crisis are, well, used to push through some pretty radical changes.
Right. And what's really fascinating, I think, is Klein's central argument. She proposes that these large-scale crises, natural disasters, economic collapses, political upheavals, they create a state of collective shock. Disorientation, really, across society.
Like how an individual might react to trauma.
Precisely. The analogy holds quite well. People in shock can be much more open to suggestion, more willing maybe to accept drastic changes they'd normally fight against.
Yeah. Klein argues that just like someone in shock might abandon deeply held beliefs under intense pressure, entire societies, when they're reeling from a major crisis, can end up giving up values they would typically defend fiercely.
And crucially, she argues this isn't just random opportunism happening. There's a strategy, she says, with roots in a very specific school of economic thought.
Okay, so let's trace that back. Where does this thinking come from?
Well, if you look at the period after World War II, say the mid-20th century, there was a pretty dominant approach to economics, especially in Latin America. Think the connoisseur, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, parts of Brazil.
Right.
This was the era of developmentalism, Keynesian economics. The basic idea was that governments should play a pretty active role in guiding the economy, building infrastructure, supporting local industries, some protectionism. Raul Prebisch at the UN Economic Commission for Latin America was a key figure promoting this.
Okay, so government intervention was kind of the norm then.
It was, yes. But then you see a reaction building against this. This is where the Chicago School of Economics comes in, with Milton Friedman as probably its most prominent voice.
Ah, Friedman. So what was their counter-argument? What were they pushing for?
Essentially, the Chicago School emerged as a direct challenge to that Keynesian consensus. They argued for a much, much smaller role for the state in the economy. Their core tenets were things like deregulation, fewer government rules on business, privatization, selling off companies and services owned by the state, and free trade, really knocking down barriers to international commerce.
And Friedman was key to making this sound credible.
He was incredibly effective. He had this ability to lend a sort of scientific aura, a sense of objective authority to what were essentially very pro-business positions. And this, well, it helped attract a lot of funding and influence to the Chicago School.
So this Chicago School thinking provided the, let's say, intellectual ammo for a completely different way to run an economy.
Exactly. And Klein points to Indonesia back in 1965 as a really early and frankly quite disturbing example of where these ideas started to intersect with political upheaval.
Indonesia's 65. What happened there?
You had this violent coup in 1965. And significantly, Klein highlights the role of economists who had connections to Berkeley. They're sometimes called the Berkeley Mafia.
Okay.
Now, this coup achieved a political goal, eliminating a nationalist movement seen as a threat. But it also, very conveniently, created a much more favorable climate for foreign investment. It essentially opened the door.
A sort of blueprint, maybe?
Perhaps. And the connection wasn't lost on people at the time. There's this chilling detail Klein mentions. Graffiti appearing in Santiago, Chile, just before the coup against a land that read, "Jakarta is coming."
Wow, a direct warning.
And it certainly looks that way. A perceived link between these events showing this model could be replicated.
And then in a way, Jakarta did come to Chile in 1973 with Pinochet's coup. Klein really positions this as the first full-blown laboratory for the shock doctrine, doesn't she?
She absolutely does. Pinochet, while ruthless and effective at establishing authoritarian control, really didn't have much economic expertise himself.
Right. He was a military man.
Exactly. And this created a vacuum, an opening. And into that gap stepped the Chicago boys, Chilean economists, many trained at the University of Chicago under Friedman and others. They saw their chance to implement these radical free market policies they believed in.
Was it straightforward, though? Did the whole military junta just say, okay, Chicago boys, run the economy?
Not entirely, no. Klein describes an internal power struggle within the junta. You had some elements who basically wanted to turn the clock back to how things were before Allende, a more traditional conservative approach. But then you had the Chicago proponents pushing for this really radical top-to-bottom liberalization, a much deeper transformation.
And this is where the story takes a really, really dark turn. Klein draws a direct line between imposing these economic shocks and the systematic use of torture, particularly in the connoisseur. That's a horrifying connection.
It is deeply disturbing. The logic, as Klein outlines it, based on testimonies and reports, was that the military juntas believed society itself needed to be purged of the error, their word of collectivism, of socialism. Political repression was one tool.
Okay.
But they extended that logic to individuals, people imprisoned, opponents. Their minds also needed to be cleansed. Torturers, chillingly, sometimes describe themselves almost like doctors or surgeons.
Surgeons.
Yes, administering therapy, using electroshocks, beatings, psychological abuse, not just for information, but as a supposed cure for socialist ideas, for the very desire for collective action. Pinochet himself apparently used a gruesome analogy about cutting out gangrene to save the body politic.
So it wasn't just about intelligence gathering, it was more fundamental.
Much more. The goal, based on survivor testimonies from truth commissions, was often to break solidarity, to force betrayal. For many on the left in Latin America then, solidarity, that sense of community, mutual support, was a core principle. Torturers seemed to understand that. They aimed to destroy those bonds, often focusing on forcing acts of betrayal, naming names, renouncing beliefs to instill deep shame and humiliation, effectively isolating the individual. It was about breaking the person's spirit and their connection to others.
Yeah, and Klein connects this logic, this idea of eliminating unwanted beliefs, to other contexts, too.
She draws a parallel, for instance, to the mass theft of Indigenous children in places like Canada and Australia. A different context, obviously, but a similar underlying logic of trying to eradicate a culture, a way of thinking, deemed undesirable by the dominant tower.
And that discovery, the torture center found in the basement of a luxury shopping mall in Buenos Aires, the Galerías Pacifico. What a symbol.
It's an incredibly potent symbol, isn't it? Extreme brutality hidden just beneath the surface of consumerism and supposed modernity. It starkly illustrates this duality.
Did organizations reporting on this at the time make that economic connection?
It's interesting. Klein notes that Amnesty International's big 1976 report on Argentina, while absolutely vital in documenting the horrific human rights abuses, didn't really dig deep into the economic motivations behind the repression. In contrast, she points to groups like the Comité para la Paz in Chile, who apparently recognized much earlier on that the fight for human rights was fundamentally tangled up with the fight over who controlled Chile's wealth and resources. They saw the link.
Okay, so Chile was the lab. Where else did this shock therapy approach get applied? Klein talks about Jeffrey Sachs in Bolivia in the mid-80s.
Yes, Bolivia, 1985. Jeffrey Sachs, who later became very famous, was advising the government there, and they implemented a really rapid, severe package of free market reforms. Price controls, gone, overnight. Currency, sharply devalued. Government spending, slashed. Wages, big cuts.
What was the immediate impact on people?
Pretty devastating for many. Real wages just plummeted. Some estimates Klein cites suggest falls of 40%, even up to 70% for some groups. Inequality soared. You had this huge gap open up between a small, wealthy elite and the majority, especially the rural poor.
And did the President Paz have a mandate for this? Did people vote for these changes?
That's a key point Klein makes. President Paz really didn't campaign on this platform. He won the election without promising such drastic measures, which is why terms like voodoo politics or just plain lying were used to describe how these policies were brought in. There wasn't broad public consent.
And like Chile, presumably this caused social upheaval. Protests.
Absolutely. There was significant social unrest, strikes, protests, but similar to how the violence in Chile was often downplayed in narratives about its economic miracle, Klein argues that the resistance and the harsh crackdown in Bolivia were often minimized or left out of later accounts that painted Bolivia purely as a free market success story. The human cost gets erased.
And Sachs took this model elsewhere.
He did. He later became a key advisor in Poland during its transition from communism in the late 80s and early 90s. Again, he advocated for very rapid, radical shock therapy, the Sachs Plan.
What did that involve in Poland?
A lot of the same elements. Rapid price liberalization, currency stabilization, but also massive, fast privatization of state-owned industries. This actually clashed quite sharply with the initial vision of Solidarnosc, the trade union movement that had been so central to challenging communism.
How so?
Solidarnosc initially had ideas more focused on worker ownership or co-management of enterprises. Sachs's plan prioritized speed and selling things off quickly, often to foreign investors or a small group of insiders, rather than that more democratic, worker-focused model.
So this pattern keeps repeating. Crisis, shock, Radical free market reforms pushed through quickly, often bypassing democratic debate or even consent.
That's the core pattern Klein identifies, and she argues you see it again during the Asian financial crisis in 1997.
The Asian tigers. But weren't they held up as free market success stories before the crisis?
That's the irony, Klein points out. While they were often lauded as models of laissez-faire, many of these so-called Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, etc., had actually used quite a bit of state intervention, protectionism, and industrial policy to fuel their growth.
Ah, okay, so the narrative didn't quite match the reality.
Not entirely. But when the crisis hit in 97, the IMF stepped in with bailout packages. And the conditions attached. You guessed it. Shock therapy. More deregulation, privatization, austerity, often imposed rapidly, sometimes bypassing democratic processes.
How did they bypass democracy?
Klein gives examples like emergency decrees being used in Thailand to push through IMF conditions, or even reports suggesting external pressure influenced the outcome of elections in South Korea to ensure a government compliant with the IMF program was installed.
And the social cost there.
Significant and long-lasting in many places. Klein highlights South Korea, for instance, where the crisis led to persistent high unemployment for years afterward, and tragically, a documented rise in suicides linked to the economic hardship.
So after the Soviet Union collapsed, it seemed like capitalism had sort of won. Did this shock doctrine approach just become the default global strategy then?
For a while in the 90s, it certainly seemed like unfettered capitalism was the only game in town. There wasn't a major ideological competitor on the world stage.
But Klein argues that even when opposition did start to reemerge, the proponents of this model didn't back down.
No, her argument is that they just became more adept at finding, or even, some might argue, creating new shocks to exploit. The fundamental strategy didn't change, it just adapted to new circumstances.
Which brings us to the era of disaster capitalism, as she terms it, particularly post-9/11, with the Bush administration, figures like Cheney and Rumsfeld.
Exactly. This is where the concept really crystallizes. Donald Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense, even before 9/11, had this vision of radically outsourcing huge chunks of the military's functions, logistics, support, even security to private companies.
Privatizing war, essentially.
That's what it looked like. And the 9/11 attacks provided this immense shock, this crisis atmosphere that allowed that agenda to be accelerated dramatically. It created the justification and the opportunity.
And Iraq then became the ultimate laboratory for this disaster capitalism.
Tragically, yes. Klein paints the invasion and occupation of Iraq as a prime example. Paul Bremer, who ran the Coalition Provisional Authority, implemented incredibly radical free market reforms almost immediately.
What kind of reforms?
Things like attempting wholesale privatization of Iraq's state-owned enterprises. Oil was initially excluded, but almost everything else was on the table. Slashing corporate taxes, opening Iraq's borders completely to imports with very low tariffs.
How did Iraqis react to that? Businesses, workers?
There was huge resistance. Iraqi businesses, which had operated in a protected economy for decades, suddenly couldn't compete with this flood of cheap imports. They were devastated.
And workers?
There was deep hostility towards privatization, especially among workers in those state-owned factories. Klein mentions reports of threats of violence against anyone involved in trying to buy or manage these enterprises. People saw it as selling off their national patrimony during a time of chaos.
Did Bremer try to manage this politically? Through elections?
Well, Klein cites instances where Bremer actively interfered in local elections, trying to prevent candidates seen as hostile to the occupation's economic plans from winning. The idea was to install compliant local leaders.
And the darker side, the violence. We heard about torture earlier in Latin America. Did that reappear in Iraq?
Disturbingly, yes. Numerous reports surfaced of torture being used by Iraqi security forces, often in facilities run or overseen by coalition forces, raising serious questions about the role of U.S. training and oversight. The Abu Ghraib scandal was just the most visible example.
And kidnapping became rampant, too.
Yes, a massive kidnapping industry boomed in the chaos. It wasn't just political. It became a horrific business, often targeting ordinary Iraqis, with families sometimes extorted for ransom even after their relatives were killed or imprisoned. It showed a complete breakdown of security and social order.
So despite applying all these shock tactics, the invasion itself, the rapid economic changes, the repression, did the project actually work in Iraq, even on its own terms?
Klein argues pretty forcefully that it was a profound failure. The The corporatist project, the attempt to remake Iraq into this free market model, largely collapsed amidst the violence and resistance it generated.
But they still went after the oil.
I know, absolutely.
Huh.
Even amidst the chaos, a controversial new oil law was pushed very hard. This law was designed, Klein argues, to shift control over Iraq's vast oil reserves away from the Iraqi state and towards long-term contracts highly favorable to foreign oil companies.
How was it pushed through?
Through intense pressure, often bypassing proper parliamentary debate or even full understanding by many Iraqi officials, leveraging the ongoing instability and the dependence on coalition forces, it was done without genuine national consensus.
And the outsourcing didn't stop with logistics. You mentioned interrogation, too.
Right. Klein highlights the role of private contractors like CSCI, an IT company, getting contracts for interrogation services in places like Abu Ghraib. It blurred the lines completely. Was it information gathering, technology services, or something much darker? It exemplified this trend of privatizing core state functions, even the most sensitive ones, within this disaster context.
It's not just wars and political coups, though. Klein shows this logic applies to natural disasters, too. Sri Lanka after the tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans.
Exactly. These are key examples for her. In Sri Lanka, after the devastating 2004 tsunami, she describes how coastal lands, often inhabited by fisherfolk for generations, were quickly rezoned for tourism development. A corporate task force emerged, pushing through free market policies related to land use and investment that had been stalled before the disaster. The tsunami provided the shock.
And New Orleans after Katrina.
A very similar pattern. The flooding devastated the city, displacing huge numbers of predominantly Black, lower-income residents. In the aftermath, Klein details how the reconstruction effort heavily favored outside corporations and developers.
How so?
Huge tax breaks were offered, regulations were waived, public services like schools were rapidly privatized or turned into charter schools. It created an economic boom for certain companies and contractors, but many original residents, particularly the poor, found it incredibly difficult to return and rebuild their communities. The city's demographics shifted.
And this idea of private security bubbles.
Yeah, she notes the rise of companies offering bespoke disaster protection and recovery services, but primarily for corporations or wealthy enclaves, creating these zones of safety and continuity for the privileged while public services struggle or collapse around them. Another facet of disaster capitalism.
It's a pretty bleak picture. Klein also mentions this paradox, the Davos dilemma, observed around 2007. Global growth happening despite all this chaos.
Right. It was this observation at the World Economic Forum. The global economy seemed to be thriving, growing, even with wars, terrorism, natural disasters, and widespread instability.
How is that possible?
Klein suggests it points to something potentially quite disturbing about the system itself, that it might actually thrive on this kind of instability, or at least has become incredibly resilient to it. Perhaps the constant drive for growth and deregulation creates the conditions for disasters, and then the system profits from the cleanup and reconstruction, a self-perpetuating cycle.
But she does end on a slightly more hopeful note, suggesting this era might be ending.
She does see some signs of change, yeah. Particularly in Latin America, there's been a degree of symbolic justice with arrests and convictions related to the Pinochet era and other dictatorships that implemented these policies.
And new leaders being elected.
Exactly. The election of governments in places like Chile and Argentina explicitly rejecting the legacy of the Chicago school experiments indicates a shift, a desire to move away from that model.
And maybe the biggest factor is just awareness.
That seems to be her main point of optimism. As the mechanisms of the shock doctrine, the exploitation of crisis, the rapid imposition of unpopular policies become more widely recognized and understood by the public.
The element of surprise is lost.
Precisely. That disorientation, that collective shock she identifies as so crucial for the strategy to work, might diminish if people know what to look for. It potentially makes it harder to push through unwanted economic shocks when people are anticipating the playbook.
So if we boil it all down, the core idea, the shock doctrine, is this recurring pattern. Exploit a major crisis war, disaster, collapse to ram through radical free market policies that benefit a select few, often using authoritarian means and causing massive social disruption.
That captures the essence of Klein's argument, yes. It's a framework for understanding how certain economic agendas have been advanced globally over decades, often riding the wave of tragedy and chaos.
And even if, as Klein suggests, the element of surprise is fading a bit, The underlying pressures, economic inequality, climate change creating more disasters, geopolitical instability, those haven't gone away.
Not at all. The potential for future shocks is arguably higher than ever. So the framework, the need to be vigilant about how crises are responded to, remains incredibly relevant.
Which really leaves you, the listener, with a final thought, doesn't it? Thinking about everything we've just unpacked from Klein's work. How does understanding this concept, the shock doctrine, change the way you look at current events? How you interpret government responses to crises, whether it's a pandemic, an economic downturn, or a natural disaster? What responsibility might informed citizens have now in recognizing these patterns when they appear? It definitely gives you a different lens to view the world through.